Some people call it creative confidence as well. Creative courage, creative confidence is all the same. In order to have that creative courage or confidence, the leader has to set the right tone or the right climate.
Welcome, everyone, to Culture by Design. I'm thrilled today to have with me Mark Polson, an incredibly talented gentleman that I've known for a few years. Mark, welcome to the podcast. I'm so grateful that you would take some time to join us.
I'm happy to be here, Tim. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, it's good to see you. For our listeners, I want to tell you a little bit about Mark. So Mark is principal and founder of Poulson and Associates, a consultancy focused on design thinking and helping organizations build their capabilities in creativity and innovation. Let me go back a little bit. So in August of 2021, Mark was appointed associate professor for the MPS Cosmetics and Fragrance Marketing and Management program in the School of Graduate Studies at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York. Now, Mark, I think that's part of the state university system, is it not?
Yes, that's correct. Fashion Institute of Technology, or FIT, is part of what we call the SUNY system.
Yeah, it's part of the SUNY system. That's right. Prior to his appointment, he had been an adjunct professor for 15 years, teaching the courses Managing the Creative Process. As a passionate advocate of lifelong learning, he's been recognized twice with faculty leadership awards and voted on by MPS students. In 2021, Mark was also the recipient of the Cody Award for Professional Excellence, given to distinguished alumni of the MPS program. Prior to that, Mark was with the Estee Lauder companies for over 28 years. As vice president of creativity and business innovation, he worked closely with business units across the organization to help teams develop a design-driven approach. We'll talk about that, what that means, a design-driven approach to solving strategic business issues, especially in the use of design thinking tools and methodologies. Over the course of his career working at the Estee Lauder companies, he consulted with leadership teams in the UK, Europe, South Africa, and Asia Pacific. He is a member of the Rutgers Business School Marketing Program Advisory Board. He also sits on the boards of several philanthropies. He holds a Bachelor of Industrial Design degree from Syracuse and a Master of Professional Studies from the Fashion Institute of Technology. Mark, wow, it's an incredible background that you have. I want to go back and get a little biographical with you. How did you get into the beauty industry from the beginning? Tell us a little bit about your background, maybe even back up and just give us a quick sketch and then tell us how you got here.
Well, it's interesting because, one of the things that I always tell people, and I actually tell my students, when I was in college, I had this notion that your career trajectory sort of went in this kind of northeast direction, ending up in that upper right-hand quadrant. And it was just that linear progression. Well, that was a kind of a naive thought. And obviously over the years, I've learned that, that's not quite the case. And your career can go through many, many fits and starts. To really, really go back, the reason that I went to school for industrial design is because I actually wanted to be an automotive designer. And I ended up really not following that passion, but I was very interested in product design and the look of products. That was something that I really wanted to pursue. So when I graduated from Syracuse, I spent the first few years of my career working in various roles as a junior designer in both some small consulting firms, and I had some corporate roles.
So design was always in you.
Oh, design was always in me. I mean,
it was in your DNA from the beginning.
I mean, even as a small child, I was always fascinated by the look of things. I may be giving away a little bit much about my age, but as a small child, I grew up in an era when cars still had tail fins. That kind of really
Yeah.
It sparked my imagination. The other thing that, it's funny how certain things influence us and what we end up doing with our lives. I feel that one of the primary influences on my desire to go into industrial design was as a young child going to the 1964 World's Fair
In New York.
in New York. Yeah, which was I don't know how many people in your audience are of an age where they remember it, but it was something that can really set your imagination on fire. What I think of as kind of being an industrial designer's dream, especially going to the car pavilions, the General Motors pavilion and the Ford pavilion, which painted these absolutely amazing and optimistic visions of what the future was going to be. And I really felt like I wanted to be part of that.
That event, was that like a turning point or a defining experience that just fired your imagination?
I think it was an inflection point for me. It was that, and again, as a very young adolescent, I found a book in my public library called the Ford Book of Styling, which was a promotional book that Ford had put out in the early 60s and was really kind of to promote the design function at the Ford Motor Company. And as you flip through the pages, you saw pictures of designers working on drawing boards and drawing these, amazing sketches of automobiles, or working in these big studios and building and making clay models of the cars of the future. And I just decided that that was something that I wanted to be part of.
That's amazing. So that was in you from the beginning.
Yes, absolutely.
But first, your first passion was cars.
Yeah, and still is to a certain extent.
Oh, okay. Okay, but somewhere along the line, your career path took some different turns. So keep going with the story.
As I said before, I worked for various consulting firms, and I was in corporate design offices. At a certain point in the mid '80s, there was an inflection point with the economy, and some things were slowing down. And I made a decision to take a little change in the course of my career. And what I did is I moved into a part of design that at that point, what I think was also going through some changes. It was burgeoning, and that was a design of merchandising, or what we called point of purchase displays. So all the different types of displays that you would see in the retail environment, be it supermarkets, be it department stores, be it big box retailers. So all those things, anything from cardboard pop-up displays to shelf merchandisers, on the high end of department stores, countertop displays, that sort of thing.
Everything that greets us when we have a retail experience.
Exactly. And I believe at that point, the industry early on was really populated by people who were show card artists. And I think in the '80s, it really began to become much more sophisticated. Organizations realize, or B2C organizations realize the importance of how important merchandising was. So I was kind of there at that inflection point. It was, what I considered to be a very creative area. So I stayed with it, and I worked for about two or three different companies that were producers of displays and merchandising, and mostly that their clientele, could be supermarkets, it could be CPG companies, retail drugstores, but also the beauty industry. And that particularly sparked my imagination, because just the opportunity to design something sophisticated and elegant and that appealed to the luxury market.
So that moved you into beauty eventually.
Yes, that moved me into beauty eventually. At one point, I had the opportunity, somebody gave me a lead, and I moved from a display company to, at that time, Revlon. And when I joined Revlon, I joined a small department, and I was the art director for international merchandising, which was actually a very interesting role. And I had the opportunity to work on merchandising systems for all different types of retail outlets. Many of them abroad. I didn't get to do too much traveling at that point. My boss was doing all the traveling, but I worked on merchandisers that would end up being in, at that time, duty-free stores in Hawaii, some systems for Japan. And then at that time also got the opportunity, there were some in-store in domestically in the United States, and worked for some installations that were for Revlon. At that time, Revlon was trying to make a comeback into department stores from drugstores. And also, there are some of the higher end brands that Revlon had at that time. One of them, principally, being Princess Marcella Borghese. I had got some experience of working on in-store environments as well.
Fantastic. And then eventually you're at Estee Lauder for 28 years, and we could talk about that for a long time. But I want to come back to this concept that you and I have talked about before, Mark, and that is design thinking. Design thinking. In basic terms, what is it? And do some people have it and some people don't? Because one of the ways that we kind of partition ourselves as humans is that people tend to say, I'm artistic or I'm not, right? I think that's kind of a demarcation that we often use. And people describe themselves as being artistic or not. So how does design thinking play into this? What is this?
I want to get into design thinking, but before we even talk about that, I want to kind of double click on your comment about being creative or not. And over the years at Estee Lauder, I worked with various consultants, and I did some research myself. What I came to learn, there are actually instruments out there that can help you determine this, that creativity is actually a very human thing. We tend to think of creativity as being talent. You may hear people say, "Oh, she's so talented. Look how artistic she is." But creativity is really something that falls along a continuum. So everyone falls somewhere along that continuum, and let's think of it as being one end of the continuum as being people who like to work within a very high structured type of situation. They like working within a set of rules. They like working within existing paradigms. Whereas at the other end are people who are, let's say, they are lower structured, and they're less likely to work within existing paradigms. They may even try to create their own rules. So those are the two ends of the spectrum, and everyone falls somewhere along in between. And there are some instruments out there that will help you determine where you might fall. And really, what this speaks to is one's approach to problem solving. So everyone goes about solving problems in different ways. When you begin to break it down, when we talk about creativity, what is creativity really? Creativity, one of the definitions of creativity, it's not the only definition, but one of the definitions is that creativity is about problem solving. You don't come up with creative solutions unless there's some sort of issue that needs to be solved.
Well, it's interesting, Mark, because when you said spectrum or continuum, I immediately thought, oh, he's going to talk about people that are less creative, and it goes from less to more. But that's not the way that you framed it at all. You're talking about a spectrum that runs from unstructured to highly structured. So it's not about less or being less or more creative. It's about the way that you're creative. So everybody's included.
Everyone's included. So the reason why I like this type of approach is that it's not pejorative in any way, shape, or form. Now, there are instruments out there, there are measurements of level of creativity, but it is completely unrelated to style of creativity. Style. It's about people's creative style. What's your style? And no, there is not one style is not better than the other. As someone I used to work with used to say, any place is a good place to be. Now, when we're having that conversation, one style of problem solving or one style of creativity, it's a much more important conversation to have than talking about level of creativity.
Have you found yourself going through life trying to convince people that they are creative when they self-label themselves as not being creative? You're trying to disabuse them of, hey, don't call yourself a non-creative type. I imagine that you've come up against that again and again and again.
I spent a lot of time at Estee Lauder trying to convince people. We built some workshops within Estee Lauder, first really for people within the New York headquarters. That was a program that was about creativity and innovation, and how do you develop it and how do you work with it. And as I said in my bio, I had the opportunity to take these programs and these workshops on the road and brought them to various parts of the world: Europe, Asia Pacific region, South Africa. But the interesting thing that I found is because this is very much a human thing. It's not something that's about particular cultures, although we may see certain cultures as being more rigid than others or more freer than others. It is pretty much a human thing. And when we use that instrument to determine people's style of creativity, the results are largely the same, all around. The spread of people across the continuum doesn't seem to vary very much.
So it didn't matter if you were going into a different cultural zone, right? You could be in Europe, you could be in Asia Pacific, you could be in Latin America.
Yeah,
You saw the same patterns.
you saw the same pattern. So, if I was in Japan, which people may think of Japanese people are, one particular way, there was no different from, Australia or the UK or Germany or France.
So the stereotypes melted away.
Stereotypes melted away. It's a human thing. What happens is when you start to frame creativity in that way and start to pull it away from it's all about being artistic or it's about being musically inclined, and you open it up and it's really about solving problems and bringing new ideas together in a new and interesting way, it becomes empowering to people. And oftentimes we've had people, who originally walked into the session saying, this is going to be terrible. I'm not creative in it in any way. I'm so not creative. I work with numbers. People walking out saying, wow, I really am creative.
Yeah. So, Mark, what you're doing is you're changing the question. The instinctive question, maybe for many people, is to ask themselves, am I creative or not? Am I a creative type? And what you're saying is, whoa, 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 whoa. Let's replace that question with this question: how am I creative? Get to know the way that you're creative. Do you like a lot of structure? Do you like a little structure? What is your style of being creative? You are creative. You just need to know how. You need to get to know yourself. So much of this is a journey in self-awareness, it seems.
Absolutely, Tim. What you just said is very similar to the way we would frame it and say, everyone asks themselves, how creative am I? Well, the more important question is, how am I creative, as you just said? That's the more important question to ask, especially when you're working within organizations.
Okay, so let's segue to another relationship that is so vital. And this is an arena that you've been in for so many years, and that is the relationship between creativity and culture. So the conditions around you, the climate around you, the atmosphere around you, the relationship between those two. Let's talk a little bit about that. What have you learned about that?
There's other bodies of research that speak to this idea of, well, why are some organizations considered to be more creative or more innovative than other organizations? Is it because of the amount of R&D spend? Does it have something to do with the technology that they have? Does it have something to do with the way that they hire talent? But out of some research that came out of Sweden in the 70s, this research showed that it wasn't any of that at all. It was actually the prevailing climate within an organization, which is different from culture, but the climate spoke to the prevailing moods, attitudes, and behavior, and the current actions of what essentially is going on in the room. So to give you an example, the culture of an organization spreads throughout the organization. So no matter where an office might be located within an organization, more or less, it's that culture of that company. The climate can be quite different. So the climate going on in an office in a headquarters in New York can be significantly different than the climate going on in the office in let's say Paris. And that is largely it's driven by many factors, but the research shows that about 2/3 of climate is driven by leadership.
So, Mark, when you say that, climate, does that primarily mean local culture, kind of the microculture of a given office or team or location or group?
It's more like a microclimate. It really has to do with what are the attitudes, what are the behaviors that are going on, what people see, and people tend to model the behavior of their leaders, how leaders are treating ideas, how are leaders treating questions, how are leaders treating news from their team that may not be the news that they necessarily want to hear.
Point is that it's going back to the modeling behavior of the leader. And it's based on the direct interactions of that leader or leaders with their people. And that's the key factor that accounts for that climate. And then that climate, in turn, from a creativity standpoint, is drawing people out, or it's not drawing them out, it's maybe shutting them down. So I can't imagine the examples and the case studies that you've witnessed of this over the years and how profoundly that climate is affecting the creativity.
I can give you one example from my own experience. Many, many years ago, when I was part of a different team, at a certain point, our team got a new boss. Someone who had been based in Paris was given more responsibility, and she became the manager of our team. And she would come in every 6 weeks from Paris and spend a week with us. When she first started as our leader, she brought all of us into a conference room and sat us down and handed us all a sheet of paper. And the sheet of paper literally said, the rules. And as she began talking, she started pounding her fist on the table and saying, the reason mistakes are made is because people don't follow the rules. And she kept repeating it over and over again. You could hear a pin drop in the room. And, we were sitting at a big round marble table. And I turn around and I look at my colleagues, and I slowly see all the color begin to drain from everybody's face. But over time, I mean, you can fill in the blanks. You can imagine what happened over time. Is morale dropped, productivity dropped, and at a certain point over time, this particular individual ended up exiting the company.
So it came down to the leader's ability to draw people out. It reminds me of, there's a statement by Henri Matisse, the French impressionist. He said, it's very simple. He just said, creativity takes courage. I find myself thinking about that. Creativity takes courage. Well, other people can help you with that, right? The culture, the team, the leader can help you with that. You ultimately will make the choice as to whether you will release your creative potential or not, but the culture is going to have a big impact on your willingness to do that. It's vulnerable behavior, isn't it? Creativity is vulnerable behavior.
Completely. And some people call it creative confidence as well. Creative courage, creative confidence is all the same. In order to have that creative courage or confidence, the leader has to set the right tone or the right climate. Very much related to psychological safety, Tim, which is something that you know about very well. Without that, people are going to be afraid to put their ideas forward. Or if the leader, if the ideas fall on deaf ears, at a certain point, people are just going to throw up their hands and say, well, no one's going to listen to me anyway. Why should I even bother?
Well, let's talk about that, though. You said something that I think is interesting. You said fall on deaf ears. If you put some kind of creative expression out there, what do you want? You want a response. You want people to react to it. So if it falls on deaf ears, if there's indifference, if no one cares, well, isn't that the same as having that act of creative expression punished? It's a form of punishment.
It absolutely is. There's no question about it. Let me put it this way. What I learned through my experience as I was, working at Estee Lauder and going to some of these workshops, I had the opportunity to talk to a lot of people, all different countries. And what I found was people, even if their ideas were not really accepted or they were told that maybe we're not ready for that yet, that was okay. What people really wanted was to know that their ideas were heard, or they wanted to know, well, where were their ideas going? Had it gone through some channels? Was it considered? Where was it? And some sort of response back saying, you had a really interesting idea. I think the timing may not be right for it, but let's hold that thought.
You still validated the idea.
Validate the idea. You validate the person.
You validate the person, even if the timing's not right or something like that, right?
And it's as simple as, I was taught a little tool years ago as a way of as how a leader can react when someone comes to them with an idea. And it's called PPC, positives, potentials, and concerns. So it's a way of framing feedback to somebody when they come to you with an idea. So you start off, you have a conversation about what's positive about it. What do you like about it? What are the potentials? Where could you possibly see this idea being implemented? Where could it possibly go? And then finally, then you may express what concerns you may have about the idea. It's a framework, and I found it's actually quite effective. And I think the person will walk away from the conversation feeling very good about themselves and feeling very good about that discussion.
And it draws them out. So let me ask a related question, Mark. One of the things that I see people in organizations do is they're so deeply socialized to believe that when they put an idea on the table, it needs to be crystallized. It needs to be evidence-based. It needs to be completely thought through. So what does that do? That has the effect of neutralizing the desire to put ideas on the table, because from a creative standpoint, what if your idea is raggedy? What if it's half-baked? What if it's a gut instinct, but you think there's some merit to it, there's something to it, and you feel that I want to express it? Well, if you've been deeply socialized in this culture that says you don't put anything on the table until it's refined, crystallized thinking, it kind of reminds me of manufacturing, right? We begin with raw material, and then we go to semi-finished goods, and then we go to finished goods, the final product. And so there's this expectation in many cultures that you need to put finished goods on the table. Who's going to do that? So I think about the violence that must do to the creative process.
It's interesting. So two comments on that. A raw idea in that form that you're talking about. And again, this is a conversation that I've had. You're bringing forth an idea that's brand new. How can you measure that? You have nothing to benchmark it against. How can you measure something that's completely new to the world? There's nothing else to benchmark it against. So you can't evaluate it against existing metrics.
And certainly not past performance, right? As you say, there's nothing there. There's nothing there.
There is nothing there. That's it. It's a blank sheet of paper. Again, the other part of that is going back to, okay, so it's in a rough form, rather than saying, and it goes back to an old improv exercise. Instead of saying yes, but, the improv exercise goes, it's about yes and. So when you say yes, but, that shuts down the conversation entirely. But when you say yes and, that gives the opportunity to build upon the conversation. And they sound so simple, Tim, don't they? I mean,
they do.
But they work.
They work. Okay, so we need to stop there. They sound so simple, but they work. They're time tested. There are some practices here with creativity that are they've passed the test of time. Mark, let's come back to design thinking a little bit. As I've studied design thinking a little bit, people say an important part of that is to use empathy. So we need empathy as we're trying to figure out how to interact with our environment and how to design something. What does that mean?
The whole idea of design thinking it's really based on this idea of considering the human, the technological, and the strategic needs of the business or the entity for the question that you're answering. Human being the key factor here. Sometimes it's called human-centered design. And what that is suggesting is that you're designing for someone, what is the particular problem that this person may have that needs to be solved for it. And what's interesting about it is in your initial research, you are oftentimes uncovering unarticulated needs, which leads to the opportunity to innovate into new space.
Okay, hang on a second. So I think so when we set out to design something, we're designing for, we're solving for something. But what I hear you saying, Mark, is that along the way, it's an emergent process and you may surface some needs or opportunities that you are not anticipating.
Exactly. Because it's so much starting from, a place of ambiguity, let's say a blank sheet of paper. It's less of a puzzle. Sometimes you're putting puzzles together, but it's really not so much that. It's really starting from this blank sheet of paper. A lot of the design thinking methodology evolved. It's not new. It started in the 1960s, but the folks at Stanford were really the ones that really started doing research on it. Actually, one of the folks that was involved at that time was a professor, a man named Rolf Fasti, who, interestingly enough, was one of my professors back at Syracuse before he went to Stanford. So he was one of the proponents. What evolved at Stanford was something called the D School, where design thinking is taught. One of their colleagues was a man named David Kelly, who eventually founded the firm IDEO. As a lot of people are familiar with the firm, the innovation firm. And IDEO is really the firm that really brought design thinking into the mainstream and really socialized it and popularized it as a business methodology. And basically what it comes down to, it depends on who you're talking to, but there are 5 basic steps to design thinking. There's that first step of empathy or empathizing, as you brought up, Tim. Then there's problem definition or problem framing. There's an ideation phase. That's, where kind of all the brainstorming happens. And because there's a bias toward action with design thinking, the idea is to get into some sort of rapid prototype very quickly, no matter how crude it is, to try out or experiment on the idea. Then you test out the idea. One of the things that I like about design thinking is it's an extremely iterative process. It seems linear, but at each step of the way, if something's not working, you go back and you try something else, but working in a very rapid manner.
So this is innovation in action, in essence, right?
Absolutely.
What else gets in the way of that? You've been in the trenches for so many years, seeing it happen and seeing it not happen. I'm sure you've worked with teams at times, Mark, that were teams that were filled with incredibly talented people, creative people, to use that word, and yet they didn't perform. They were not able to produce much, right? Even though you would think that they would have. And then perhaps other teams that you worked with where maybe your expectations were low, and then lo and behold, they just shock everyone with what they're able to come up with.
It's a complex question, Tim, but I think mostly a lot of what it comes down to is an organization's capacity to tolerate ambiguity or to tolerate uncertainty, because there is a certain level of comfort that you have to have with ambiguity in a process like this. There is a lot of learnings from trying something and maybe failing at it, and what did you learn from that kind of failure? And there are many organizations that they don't have a tolerance for those kinds of things.
Yeah, that's so true. One of the things that I love to say to leaders is that every source of competitive advantage that you enjoy today is melting. The only question is the rate of the melt. And so if that's true, then the sustainable source of innovation is your people and your culture. That's where we go back to. If we're trying to create an incubator of innovation, a sustained capacity to innovate, doesn't it come back to that? I mean, isn't that what you were talking about at the beginning? So don't we come full circle back to the culture and the modeling behavior of leaders if we're trying to sustain this capability?
There's no question about it that it goes back to the leadership and it goes back to the people. And, again, to go full circle, it's about instilling this idea that creativity comes from everywhere, that no matter what domain you are in an organization, you have the capacity to innovate. You have the capacity to apply creativity, to come up with new ideas. And, again, it's how those local managers, how tolerant or how accepting are they of those kind of ideas. We talked about climate, but climate is one component of culture, and that also starts to become an issue of culture. Challenging because culture is very hard to change, often takes years to change. So I would say that's probably another thing that gets in the way of unleashing this creativity.
What about this? Speaking of things that get in the way, Mark, what about the hierarchy? Because if we're in a creative process, the creative process is agnostic to your title and your position and your authority. It doesn't care. It doesn't care. The creative process doesn't care about those things. But yet they can get in the way. They can neutralize people. They can shut them down. It can really be a barrier in that creative process, in the process of innovating. And so I think this is where organizations struggle. They struggle to remove that obstacle of the hierarchy getting in the way.
Well, it's interesting, Tim, because that you're bringing this up, because this is a topic now that's coming up with a lot of my grad students, in the leadership class that's going on right now. And we have these conversations, and with the research that they're doing, there's this idea, the hierarchy or the organizational structure as we know it hasn't evolved since the turn of the century and the coming of the industrial age. The hierarchy as we know it was designed for the industrial age. In today's world, really calls for a much flatter type of organization, what I think of as being kind of like nodes and rays and clusters. And I think the more an organization is able to get to that place with a flatter organization and a more networked organization, I think that's going to make them more successful.
Yeah. A related issue, Mark, that comes to mind is the difference. I think we confuse these two things in organizations and they get in the way. It gets in the way. The difference between participation rights on the one hand and decision rights on the other. It seems to me, you tell me if you think I'm wrong, that we need to be more explicit about this. And as I look at millennials and Gen Zers that are coming into the workforce, they expect psychological safety as a term of employment. They expect participation rights on day one. I was talking to some leaders the other day and they said, you know how it works here in our organization? When you come in, there's no participation rights, let alone decision rights. You have to listen for a year. And after you listen for a year, then we will grant you some participation rights very gradually, slowly. You will accumulate those participation rights. I don't know how that's going to, I don't think we can sustain that. The new employees are demanding participation rights from day one. Is that an entitlement or do you think that's appropriate?
I think it's appropriate from day one for employees to have participation rights, of course, because it goes back to that idea, that notion that good ideas come from anywhere. I was working with a project manager who was working with me, actually, Tim, someone that you know. And, when we had these meetings, she was young and she tended to try to dominate the meeting with her ideas. What I kind of coached her to do is I would say we come at the beginning of the meeting is like, we've talked enough. I want to go around the room. I want to hear what everyone thinks about what we just talked about. I want to hear all their opinions. And then, that's like, it was like a breath of fresh air for the team. So when again, climate, when you set those conditions where people are feeling that they, Tim, the whole idea of participation rights, that's all about inclusion, isn't it?
It is. It really is. Yeah.
I mean, you can bring in all, everything that, we've ever discussed about DEI. That's really what it comes down to is how can you be more inclusive? And one of the ways that you could be more inclusive is by soliciting everyone's ideas.
Well, Mark, this has been an absolutely fascinating and insightful conversation because we're seeing the relationship between design thinking, creativity, innovation, culture. These are these four big variables that we've addressed. And I appreciate you helping us understand that we've got to democratize participation and that we all are creative. It's just a matter of how we're creative. What's our creative style? It's not a binary proposition as to whether you're a creative. We even use that word, right? You're a creative or you're not a creative. Everyone, so I think that's your operating assumption. Everyone is a creative. It's just how you're creative. Am I getting it?
Yeah, you're getting it. That's it.
This has been a masterclass in creativity, in innovation, in culture, and in design thinking. And Mark, I can't thank you enough. Any final words for our listeners?
Again, just remember that for those of us who are leaders, that people model our behavior. And I think just ask more questions than telling. Ask more than tell.
I love that. What an appropriate way to conclude. Mark, thanks so much for being here with us on the podcast.
Tim, it was my honor.
Thank you. Thanks for joining me today on the Culture by Design podcast. Be sure to subscribe and listen to new episodes every week. And if you'd like to see more of the work we're doing, go to leaderfactor.com.